Okay, thank you, Richard, for this very thorough analysis of the synthesis papers, or the papers that within the synthesis that you introduced us. And our task is now to follow the synthesis on four major questions. And within the handout, blue handouts, you have the same following questions for discussions. And based on the papers, we have still some challenges to remain. And the first one is, how would career development services need to be changed to provide a broad focus upon employability and career management skills, not only upon decisions at the point of leaving the education? And the second, how can career services for young people make better use of information about the labor market? And how can employers play a stronger role in this, as we talked before lunch? And third, what priority should national career development policies give to services in higher education in order to better promote the development of employability and career management skills? And the fourth question, what needs to be done to ensure that career development services for youth can play a stronger role in preventing early school leaving and helping early leavers to return to education? And in addition to that, if we can embed in these ideas or issues in the national policies, we need to think how we implement these ideas. And training has been one of the main measures or means of implementing many big issues, and we should never ignore the importance of the training. So we have a fourth question, what changes in practice in the training and qualifications are needed to ensure such a broader focus in career development services for youth? And we have divided these questions so that tables 1 to 3 would focus on the questions number 1 and number 4, and the tables from 4 to 7 would discuss the questions 2 and 4, and tables 8 to 11, the questions 3 and 4. And for all the groups, after this we have the same task. I go briefly the procedures. So you could first discuss each of the questions in your group about 30 minutes and record the group's most important ideas related to each questions on the recording sheet. And then I will inform again the time. And then after that, you are invited to record on the chart paper the most important issue that your group discussed. And finally, discuss if there are any unresolved issues related to this theme and need to be discussed further. And if there were other important questions we were not able to identify and you were not asked related to this theme. And these are the items we want to report on the paper, like within the previous session. But there's some support material for you that you can use. On the third page, you can refer to the handbook for policymakers. There are some quotes related to this theme. And I would briefly highlight the role of the handbook, that it's targeted for policymakers, but also for practitioners and trainers in the national, regional, and local level. And it has 4 chapters that we are working during this conference. And each of the chapters have identifying the challenges, found out in the OECD activity and also the European Union activity. And then there are some key questions for consideration for policymakers and practitioners. And then there are some policy options that could be adopted based on the existing situation on national or local level, and then some examples of good practice. And within this theme, there are some themes that the handbook is highlighting. For example, that among the policy questions and options considered are the following: deal with the issue of minimum entitlements for career development services, establish these in consultation with broad stakeholder groups, including parents and employers, and also from cross-sectoral perspective, and build strong community outreach career services for at-risk students, increase the emphasis on labor market issues in all career development programs, and create employer partnerships to increase opportunities for work tasting and also for work experience and so on. And there are many good examples of practice as well. But now I'm inviting you to continue the work, and I'm briefly warning you about after 30 minutes. Thank you. about the policy handbook and the recommendations within the book, and also the work on Monday. Now when you are doing or selecting the most or identifying the most important issue, could you think that what type of policy recommendations could be included in that or related to this, so that would bring the steps more forward? And now the next 10 minutes. Your attention, it's time to start to, I'm aware of the time, it's time to collect some of the highlights. And I would like first, thank you, Peter. First focus on the tables 1 to 3 and the questions number 1 and 4. And if you have comments, tables 1 to 3, please.
We discussed questions 1 and question 1. We spent most of our time learning about the new approach to career development in Australia, which has just been introduced in 2006, and very much gave us an insight into how the third reform that was described to us this morning might work at school level. It involves the introduction or the setting up of a network of 230 local community partnerships, which have been established as a result of a tendering process where the minimum professional standards are obligatory, and this network provides schools with a resource and a supply of expertise and supports to enable school personnel to deliver their school-based programs. Now, we spent a considerable amount of time asking questions around how that has been implemented and how it very much fits in with the OECD recommendations for guidance for young people in school. And unfortunately, the time slipped away, and we learned a lot about what has happened and what is happening and what the objectives are. And there is a little booklet which you can read, and I've done a good ad for it now, and I know you'll all be picking up your booklet. In relation to question 4, the one around the changes in practitioner training and qualifications, we identified a couple of areas that we felt are worth highlighting. And one is the need for training to focus on developing skills of collaboration and of networking among the practitioners. Because we felt very strongly that traditional training hasn't developed this area adequately, and that it needs to be developed on 2 levels. One is in terms of networking and working with in-school personnel, for example, the teachers of other subjects. We're concerned that teachers, specialist teachers of subjects in the curriculum have a responsibility to focus on employability skills and to work with students around those, and that the practitioner needs to draw this together and to link up the thinking at school level. And of course also the importance of collaborating with businesses and third level education providers and so on is an area that needs to be focused upon. And finally, our last point in relation to practitioner training is the need to ensure practitioners are skilled and see the importance of tracking students so as to provide the evidence base for decisions around the provision of the service.
Thank you. And groups, tables 2 or 1, and I would like to only highlight one item, so I'm aware at a time. So not the whole detailed description of all the discussions. Thank you. 2 or 3.
One of the things that came up very clearly was the idea that there needs to be a closer link between the advice given at school, the advice given at school by subject teachers and careers advisors, parents' expectations of what's going to happen for their offspring, and also what the interest of the student is itself. There needs to be better triangulation between those 3 that doesn't seem to be happening at the moment.
Thank you. And 3.
Who else would like?
Some similar stuff in our discussions. One issue then that we came to, career services need to be properly resourced, and I learned a new word, ring-fenced money, so that the positions are in fact protected and not used for other school-based resource issues, as is commonly the case. And at the same time, if you're going to ring-fence money around career positions and career services, then the outputs and outcomes that are expected have to be pretty clearly identified. And accomplishing both of those things needs some very clear and succinct policy descriptions on the part of government.
Thank you. And now we go to question number 2. Tables 4 to 7, who wants to start?
Apologies, I was expecting it to come in from this angle. I'm just conscious of time, so I'll just say one key thing. Our group, in looking at question number 2, we really felt that bridging the policy gap between education and employment departments is a really key issue. And our solution to that was to encourage and nurture innovative joint projects that actually bridge the gap between those two public policy sectors, because without that we will have this silo mentality continue and disjuncture. We had lots of others, but in the end.
Yes, please.
We talked about roles mostly, and how we agreed with the shift that was up on the slide before in the Norwegian example of the shift from a traditional vocational match type approach to career management. And we talked about the way that would change what people's roles and jobs were, and the role of the career practitioner, for example, in schools and so on, would be different. And the role of the client would be different. And we talked about involving parents and employers and how critical that was in that. And then we talked about the implications for the training then of people such as career practitioners. And we talked about the flexibility of young people and how they were, in fact, that kind of mindset was a lot more natural to them, and in some ways they were actually a bit ahead of us there and already doing some of these things that we talk about when it comes to flexibility and management and being strategic around career management. But we didn't necessarily recognise it or know how to deal with it yet.
Thank you very much.
Table number 5, please. You had a comment.
Our important, sorry, I'm not really used to mics and I can always hear the echo. Our most important point was how can we improve relations between employers and practitioners. We recognise that there's a tension between career practitioners in schools and employers wanting a trained, work-ready young person. We thought that there was a need for increased information about labour market conditions and occupational information, not stats, but information about what really happened on a job, and that employers had a role in providing that information about their own occupations and industries. We talked about the usefulness of career expos. I use the term we use in New Zealand, though that wasn't the one that was used. And then we also talked about the need for specialist training or specialised training for career counsellors, including training in accessing information and assisting young people to access and interpret that information. And
That's fine.
no, there was one other thing. I've forgotten what the other thing was.
Yes, please.
Thank you. First of all, we wondered whether or not both the demand side and the supply side were necessarily mutually exclusive. And once we had thought about that for a little while, we got into a kind of Donald Rumsfeld side of things, because we wondered really, do we really know enough about what we need to know on the demand side before we can actually develop appropriate services and responses?
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then we go to the questions 3 and 4 and tables 8 to 11. Who wants to start?
Great. Thank you. Thank you. In regards to question number 3, we talked about a lot of things, but I can outline them in 3 major areas. And that was that we talked about the need to help young people develop other skills. We called it personality, employability skills, entrepreneurial spirit, kind of self-actualized activity skills. And then being able to take those skills and really establish the options that are available. And several countries talked about the different options that are available to post-secondary or to secondary students. And then thirdly is taking those options and actually putting them into action. So we talked a lot about programs that would allow students to experience some of the activities, to experience the workplace, to experience the kind of employment that they might be looking for down the road. Did I cover everything?
Thank you very much.
Through our discussion, we came up with 2 issues that in training it is important to train others. And it is also important that career development needs to permeate the entire schooling system.
Spencer, please.
Oh, am I on? Well, for question 3, we decided that it was more important to focus on the B part of that question, and that the real priority should be early intervention, and we underline early intervention. We also agreed that multiple strategies were required involving shared responsibility, and that career guidance should be embedded in the curriculum as early as possible. We discussed the autonomy of higher education institutions and how difficult it is to establish or to prioritise or have any policy in relation to career guidance in higher institutions because of their autonomy. So all we felt we could do is try to convince them of the need to provide more career guidance for their students.
We talked about similar things, the need for systematic career interventions at the primary and secondary school levels, the need to view career self-management as an essential life skill, perhaps to make it more central to the educational process by viewing it as such. We also talked about the range of training requirements for career practitioners, which was from 6 years of training and licensing as a counseling psychologist to no training requirements. And that range seemed, our conclusion there was that range seemed a little bit odd.
Thank you. Thank you. What Maureen said about the higher education, I have one brief comment, because then she highlighted that the universities are autonomous, and that's a fact. But if you, what we did in Finland, we had described in legislation the right for guidance as a student entitlement, and it's up to the universities how they provide it, but they must evaluate it. Mm-hmm. So that was one way we didn't threaten their autonomy. But
Can I just, I'd like to just break ranks. I had the privilege of sitting in on this table, and they were talking about some very challenging things around the need to change practitioner training, following on your point, Spencer. And I really would like Lester to tell you about what Career Services Rapura is doing in New Zealand to force that agenda, to really force us to change. So, Lester, I know I'm breaking the, but I think I'm so excited about what you're doing. I think the rest will be. You have to talk about it, Lester. Tell us.
Whoa, there's a challenge. Well, we haven't actually done a whole lot, but what we've had the chance to do is with a new course being proposed through Auckland University AUT, who are a current provider of career services. They want to provide a master's level course, is they've come to us asking for support for that to go through their processes. And the support that we've given has been conditional support upon us being able to actually work with them in terms of the concept and design of the program itself, because we are potentially, or our staff potentially, are major customers of the university in terms of who would go through the course, and that some of the issues around, particularly around a component around the relationship of practice to policy, particularly around the component about outcomes-based evaluation, particularly in a bit wider the mark here, but a component about bicultural delivery are things that are really important to us, and that we think we can actually flex our muscle on in terms of a new course being developed.
I think that I really wanted you to hear that. And would you just briefly say what you're doing in Scotland? Because the practitioner training is so important. And maybe this is a way to force the issue, through legislation or some other creed. Just a quick comment, and people can follow up with you after.
Okay, yes, I would be very happy to tell people a little bit more about it. Career Scotland is relatively new as a national organisation, and our focus very much has shifted from one-off interventions to much more the development of self-management skills in all of the individuals with whom we work. And we've also moved from a focus on young people only to people of all ages. So that has meant that the people who work for us, all our staff, we have about 1,000 people, we need to change the way that they think, and we've had a major undertaking of continuous professional development over the last few years. But what was happening was there was then very much an evident mismatch between the pre-entry training that was developing the new staff coming through, and that was in fact compounding the older ways of working which we no longer wanted. So we've therefore undertaken the development of what shape a new course might be able to look like. Now this has had, of course, some controversial issues around it, because people are very precious that the kinds of training that they've delivered for maybe 20 years, they think that this is the best that it can be. So we've had to tread very carefully on that. We also have, though, for the first time as a national organisation, buying power, in the sense that we can say an awful lot more about what we actually want the people to be able to do. And therefore this too has caused a ripple effect. But it's very important for us because we have now begun to seek support for that in other countries, particularly in the UK, to see if we can develop that as a national qualification. And already Careers Wales and also the Careers Service in Northern Ireland have shown interest in this course. And we would hope to develop it through both undergraduate and speciality postgraduate levels, so that we can very much focus this on a professional service, but one which is much wider and can understand more about the economic development side of things, understand more about the labour market, and understand that we are also trying to facilitate skill development in others and not just have a one-off, one-to-one intervention.
Thank you. And now I will give the mic to reporters. Richard, please.
Which has obviously been turned on. Tony had a real advantage in being the rapporteur for the previous session because he had some fabulous initial input that he could draw upon as well as the discussions. But this session, I mean, the input was rubbish. It was terrible. So all I can do is give a partial input based upon what I heard in the discussions in the group, and then I'll call upon my colleagues to tell the full story. There are three, if you like, stories that I heard in the tables that I overheard. One has to do with context, the other has to do with choices and priorities, and the third, or perhaps the lesser one, has to do with what I'm calling levels. I mean, first of all, the first message that I got was a parallel to Sue Richardson's message about the importance of the labour market context and differences between national labour market contexts in determining incentives and the choices that people make and the options available to them. The same seems to be understood by the people in this room in relation to education systems and schools. The extent to which, for example, systems and schools focus upon testing and assessment will have an impact upon the level of careers services that schools are willing to invest in, the nature of the curriculum, the pathways available, the flexibility of those pathways, the breadth of the curriculum and the extent of choices that young people have will have an impact upon the types of further choices they make down the road and their career outcomes. assessment practices, and in particular also teaching and learning methods will have a big impact upon the nature of career services and upon the particular outcomes in career terms for young people. So that's one of the themes that I heard, that if we want to think about the nature of career services for young people, educational contexts are just as important as labour market contexts, and educational contexts do vary systematically between countries and within countries and between schools and universities. The other one was, next one theme that I heard was something about choices and priorities. Some questions people were asking. What should we do? Focus upon developing better structures, or should we focus upon developing better services within those structures? What's more important? Basic skills, if we're thinking about young people's career outcomes, basic skills, literacy and numeracy, for example, or career-related skills, the ability to make decisions, to assess information, self-confidence, and so on. Another type of choice that people were throwing up was, should we emphasise services in primary education, secondary education, or higher education? Will it be the case that we don't need services, for example, in higher education if we get them right in primary and secondary education, so that all young people make the right sorts of choices? Another type of choice that I heard in some of the groups that I was sitting in on was one about what sorts of people practitioners should be. Should they be experts on process, for example, knowing how to set up experiences for young people, knowing how to set up the right sort of curriculum so that the structures and the systems work properly, or should they be experts who give people the right sort of advice? And should they be held accountable for that advice being correct and expert? And if they get it wrong, what should happen? Should they be sued for it? I don't know. Should their money be, the client's money be refunded? But it seemed to me, in listening to these types of choices, that many of them really were quite artificial. Because, I mean, there is no choice between having basic skills or career-related skills. Everything we know from the literature says that people's life outcomes is dependent both upon them being able to read and write up to certain minimum levels, and it's dependent upon them being self-confident, being able to make decisions, and knowing something about the way the world operates. People do take a long while to mature. Some people take longer than others, and people do change over time. So that even if we did get the services in quote right in primary and secondary education, we would still need services in tertiary education to cope with the reality of what people are. I don't see any choice at all between good systems and good career services, because it seems to me that good systems actually contain effective guidance and effective information, and they do provide people, young people, with experiences out of the school and the opportunity to learn from mentors and adults. Bad systems are ones that take no notice of the wider person. They aren't flexible in the pathways they provide. They don't recognise individual differences in learning styles, and they don't have any information, advice, or advice to help young people negotiate their way through the maze. And we know this. I mean, the literature on school reform says these are the features of good schools and bad schools. So there is no choice, it seems to me, that in focusing upon the effective policies for services for the young people, I don't think it helps to try and set up these dichotomies. The third message that I heard was one in relation to levels, and this is a very simple one, that we need to work on many levels. The national levels at the level of ministries and their relationships at schools, universities, in communities, with employers, and with practitioners. Tony and Christine.
Quickly but slowly, 3 bullet points. Lots of stuff on early intervention. Early intervention means primary, elementary schools. We need serious policy development. We've got experiments, but very few countries, serious policy development, career-related learning in primary schools. If we mean it, that's what we should be doing. Second, the paradigm shift that Richard was talking about, some people I heard saying, we've done that, but maybe gone too far. All we have is classroom. We don't have people talking to individual kids anymore. That's too far. In the end, it's an individual business, and certainly in terms of risk of falling out, it's individual. So it's got to be both. And third, whole school. If it's whole school, we've got to have serious strategies. We heard about Alberta wanting now to get career development in the industry training for all teachers, but maybe also it's about organisational change strategies. Christine.
Mine is a very quick observation again. I think in moving between the tables, what I noticed was a great deal of, understandably, emphasis upon the need for flexibility, given the sort of given the enormous movement that's occurring within the labour market. And I saw it as a three-legged stool as I was listening to people. There were one sort of leg of the stool where people were talking about the incredible importance of shifting our training in terms of career practitioners themselves so that they were more flexibly able to adapt to the requirements of the labour market. There was another leg of the stool that was actually looking at the importance of equipping individuals with a skill set, an internal skill set that gave them the flexibility to cope with whatever came their way. And then thirdly, it was a much quieter voice, but I think it's a very important part of the stool that was suggesting that we need to be making urges in the right directions so that institutions and professional associations actually start to make some shifts that enable people to move more easily between educational programs and courses and also more easily between occupations. So it was slightly shifting the focus from adaptation on the part of the individual to adaptation on the part of more staid institutions.
Thank you, Kristen. And what Tony mentioned about the overall responsibility, I can just mention that one way to do is when we updated our guidelines, we wrote that each municipality must provide a strategic plan how they promote the overall responsibility, and in addition to that, the operational descriptions about the guidance activities. So it was one way to guarantee the minimum level of the services within the educational settings. I would like you to complete this session by indicating within the flip chart the table and the session number before you leave it to Peter or Cole or me. And I would like to also thank reporters and your contribution, and also Richard for the synthesis. And I think we've deserved coffee or tea. And
so would you please join me in thanking Romo for managing that session? Afternoon tea. After afternoon tea, we change tables. The music stops.